Okay, so this is very different from the talk on Tuesday. This is about science of science. They're thinking about researcher productivity and in general sort of data-driven predictions in the science of science. And I want to start with a very broad perspective, and then we'll drill down to something specific. So in general, I think the desire to predict science is pretty much everywhere in our society. We really care about knowing what will be discovered, by whom, when, and where. And to give you some examples of just how pervasive this desire to predict science is, here are some examples. So individuals want to know what questions are interesting, impactful, or fundable. Publishers and funders want to know what manuscripts or projects will be most impactful because that's the ones that they want to fund and the ones they want to publish. Hiring committees want to know which of these applicants that have applied will be the most productive or the most impactful moving forward, most valuable contributions. And the society in general wants to know which things to fund because the tax dollars can be used to potentially accelerate scientific discovery, technological advances, or even biomedical advances. And so if prediction is done better, then lots of good things can happen. We want science to be predictable. This question of is it predictable and how is it predictable has actually been around for a long, long time. It goes back about 150 years. It started with these guys who were sociologists of science. And in the 20th century, physicists got into the game as well. But for the most part, the contributions by these people were mostly conceptual, focusing on trying to understand and articulate what are the goals of science as a field and what are the general approaches. So for instance, Weinberg said, oh, the goal of science is to explain the world, and Dyson pointed out that, well, there are different ways of going about science. There are people who are like birds who fly over large swaths of things and see the big patterns, and then there are frogs who are down there in the weeds and they see how individual little things work. And so these were really great sort of conceptual pieces in trying to understand how science proceeds and therefore maybe to make some qualitative predictions about science. But the progress towards a genuine science of science, which is actually an idea that Florian Zanecki deserves credit for coining that term, that idea of using science to understand the process of science itself, progress towards that was really slow, in part because it was really hard to get good data. You know, before computers were around, you had stacks of papers, you had to mail them to people. It was really hard to get much data in a systematic way. And for the most part, people were pretty satisfied with the judgment of experts. So you have somebody like Freeman Dyson who says, that's a good idea. And you're like, yeah, Freeman Dyson said that's a good idea. It's a good idea. Whereas now, you know, if I say something is a good idea, you might be like, okay, well, Aaron thinks it's a good idea. Well, what does the data say? Right? We all trust data a lot more than individual judgments these days. Okay. So here's a conceptual framework for understanding the sort of general idea of predictability in science itself. And this is a very simple framework. It has one axis here. One axis, okay. Unexpected things on one side, expected things on the other side. So let me unpack this a little bit. What does it mean for a scientific discovery to be unexpected? Here are some examples, things like the discovery of penicillin, the first antibiotic, or the discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation, or the discovery that we could use the CRISPR-Cas9 protein to do programmable gene editing. Or even Gödel's incompleteness theorem was quite unexpected. It wasn't something that people thought was going to happen. So unexpected discoveries, they're different because they change the way we think about the world. It's like finding a puzzle piece, if you do jigsaw puzzles, finding a puzzle piece laying over here that you didn't think was actually part of the puzzle. You're like, oh my goodness! Like, this completely changes the way I thought this part of the puzzle was arranged. And now I'm going to take everything apart and put it back together with that piece in the middle to be as the organizing idea. And so these ideas here, they definitely reorganize the way we think about the world. And as a result, they were very unexpected. On the other end of the spectrum, you have things like this. You have parts of the puzzle that are mostly done, and there's sort of one missing piece. And we're just going to put that missing piece in, and then we're going to go have some coffee because we're so happy that we finished the part of the puzzle. Examples are things like the detection of gravitational waves, LIGO. We kind of knew they were going to be there. We spent billions of dollars to detect them because we knew that they were going to be there. And sure enough, they were. That was the last puzzle piece for a large part of the puzzle that was sort of telling us that there was something here. Right? This void, we know exactly the shape of this piece because all the other evidence says that's what it should be. So LIGO was one, the Higgs boson was one, human genome sequence was another. We sort of knew what was going to be there, even though it was very valuable. And then moving towards the middle, towards the direction of unexpected, things like the structure of DNA, there was a race to discover what the structure was because everybody knew that there was something there. It's just a matter of figuring out how to get at it. Polio vaccine was another one of these things that was, we kind of knew how to do it. It's just a matter of doing the last step. So these are more expected discoveries, things that supporting evidence and data tells us that should be there. And then in the middle, you have things that are like normal discoveries, in which some elements of these things are surprising, but to some degree it fits with things we already know. So we maybe have several puzzle pieces in place, give a little bit of a hint, we find a piece that builds on that stuff. Okay? So this axis of unexpected, which reorganizes our understanding of the world, all the way to expected, which does not reorganize our understanding of the world, but might confirm our understanding of the world. That's the conceptual framework. I think this is very useful for thinking about both if you want to strike off on some new direction of research, where does it fall on the spectrum? That can be a very useful thing to diagnose. But it also helps us understand something about where are the limits of prediction in terms of the science of science. What can data help us do, and what can data not help us do? And so in particular, I think that predictability really correlates with this past or related evidence. So over here, discoveries can be very predictable, which is why we invest billions of dollars in these big science projects, because we know they're not going to fail, and we know that there's something there. Whereas over here, we have no clue what's going to happen, because it's completely unexpected. There's no data that can predict these things, because data implies evidence and supporting evidence and other puzzle pieces. So over here, this is not stuff that you can really fund strategically, because there's no indications that there's anything over here in the first place. And so the unexpected discoveries, they rearrange our understanding and they correlate poorly with the past. So data is going to be useful, is going to be most useful over here, and maybe to some degree in the middle, but probably not over here in the unexpected things. Okay. So today we have lots and lots and lots of data. It's sort of an embarrassing amount of data around. Here are some examples from the science of science. What we have, the APS data set for research, Web of Science, JSTOR, DBLP for computer science. Google Scholar is an amazing resource. I was talking with the head of Google Research a couple weeks ago, and he told me something that was absolutely terrifying, which is that Google Scholar was built by two guys on their 20% time projects. One of them is retired, and the other one is semi-retired. And this literally gave me a cold sweat, because I use Google Scholar almost every day, and you're telling me that Google is not investing any resources in maintaining this amazing tool. And his response was somewhat reassuring, but also kind of terrifying. He said, "Oh no, we're not going to let Google Scholar die. Don't worry." It's like, okay, that's good, but why aren't you helping it grow and so on? I'm not sure what's going on there. So there's sort of an embarrassment of these things that allow us to convince ourselves that maybe we can use all this data to make better predictions about the science of science, about the way science progresses, about where discoveries are, what's going to be hot, and so on. And what's really nice is that we have this really nice interdisciplinary community of people, physicists, computer scientists, biologists, economists, sociologists, statisticians. Everyone is interested these days in the science of science. And I think that's in part because, why now as opposed to 40 years ago? Well, data is one thing, computation is one thing, but something else that's changed is that science is really big. And as a result, no one person can really see the whole world of science. And so we have to use data in order to understand this enormous collective of effort. So science of science is helping us understand the whole scientific enterprise, and it may be able to help us predict how it's progressing. 40 years ago, science was smaller. You could imagine, a working group of people sort of being experts in different domains, sort of having most of the knowledge in the room. Whereas today, a group of 40 people in a room, they might know half of network science or something like that, but certainly not all of science. Okay. So we want to use this data to predict stuff. Right? So let's drill down to a specific prediction task. Can we predict just researcher productivity? And I'm going to define this very narrowly, which is I'm just going to count papers. I'm not going to try to weight papers by where they're published or how long they are. I'm just going to count how many contributions each researcher makes to sort of the general conversation that science is having. And this is not an unreasonable way to do it because like each paper is supposed to be like a unit of knowledge, and we all have this intuitive sense of like, okay, this goes in that paper, but you know, this doesn't, right? So we have this notion that there's a boundary, there's a thing we're trying to contribute. How many of these units do researchers produce and contribute to the discussion over their career? So starting at the beginning and progressing towards the end. That's what we're going to try to predict. And this should be easy because people have done this before. People have done this in a lot of different ways, and they've come up with this sort of simple canonical narrative for what researcher productivity looks like over a lifetime, which is you have this rapid rise to an early peak, and then this slow decline. Right? Rapid rise, early peak, decline or flattening over time. And it's not just researchers who do this, in fact, but we'll start with them. So here's a figure from 1986 in psychology, publication rates in psychology by age cohort. So if you're 25 to 34, that's the weighted mean publication rate per year. Here, it goes up if you get a little bit older, and then it comes down. Okay. So, Russian science and math, same thing. Here's age on the x-axis, and then here's let's see, age versus creative production rate, whatever that means, some notion of productivity. And you can see it's the same sort of pattern. It goes up, and then I'm over the hill, I'm about here, and now I'm on my slow decline. I'm not a Russian mathematician though, so maybe it's different for me. Well, here's what it looks like for English mathematicians and scientists, French mathematicians and scientists, Italian mathematicians and scientists, Germans. Oh, they're the Americans. Oh, same thing. So really everybody, when you put these things together, has this nice canonical curve. This is great, okay, and this is from 1954. People have known this for a long time. Okay, so this is really all science and math. Also, it works for hunter-gatherer groups. This is calories per day as a function of age. You can see you have this rapid rise and then this slow decline. Okay? Yeah.
So I think it's hard to say the hunter-gatherer energy consumption is corresponding to the productivity of researcher, because productivity researcher is related to the research you're getting from the younger generation. So at the age of 40, now you're the assistant professor, you have a lot of research to have. So I'm not sure how this...
Sure, there are some differences between being a hunter-gatherer and being a researcher. But let's just ignore those.
Yeah, yeah. What I was going to say used to be beyond that.
Because this pattern happens in other fields too, and I want to be able to put all these fields together. So, for instance, here's a wonderful treatise from 1835 in which he looked at criminals. So here's a page out of the book. It's in French. I don't speak French, but that's murder. That's killing kids. I don't know what rebellion means in French, but you know, this is bad stuff, right? These are all bad things. And here's age, and if you look at the numbers, you can see they start low, and then they go up, and then they come down. Okay? So criminals also exhibit this qualitative pattern of an early sharp rise to a peak, and then a slow decline. And also in this book, not in a nice paper like this, there's also data that suggests that the production of artworks also follows the same pattern. Here's a wonderful paragraph describing, translated by Google, thanks, I don't speak French, that talks about the criminal inclination. I'll read to you. This fatal inclination appears to be developed on account of the intensity of the physical strength and passions of man. It reaches its peak at age of 25. When physical development is nearly complete, the intellectual and moral development which takes place more slowly then cushions the penitent to the crime, which diminishes even later by the weakening of physical strength and passions. Right? So people have been thinking about these mechanisms for why this curve exists for a long, long time, almost 200 years. And so this pattern is seen essentially everywhere. So it's easy. We know how predictable your productivity is going to be over your lifetime because it happens everywhere, essentially. Okay. So, yes, does it appear in researcher productivity today? And we will get to that. We're going to do it using computer scientists because we have all the data for them. We have hiring data for all computer science faculty in North America. It's 205 PhD granting departments. And from DVLP, we've matched them against all of their papers. So we now have a time series of every publication published by each of these computer scientists in North America. So we have all the data that we'd like. But now we need to convert it into a form that allows us to do the analysis. And the problem is that this data sucks. This data, which we collected, squeaky clean. This data, which we didn't collect, they should have come talk to us first. So we can't trust the raw productivity scores for a number of reasons, which I'll tell you in a moment. To both detect and characterize this, what we did is we downloaded CVs for 10% of our faculty so we can get ground truth data, and then parse them manually and then compare them against the corresponding DVLP record. So now we can see how much of what's in a person's CV is also on DVLP. And what we find is that there is this systematic change in the coverage that this database has. And this axis shows you the DVLP pubs divided by CV pubs. So if it's 1, it's the same number, but if it's lower than 1, then there's lack of coverage in DVLP. And you can see that, in 1985, it's about 60% of papers, and for more recent years, it's pretty close to 100%. So DVLP is good with its coverage more recently, but it's more poor as you go further back in time. So there's a systematic bias in terms of its coverage, and it's not rocket science to figure out why. It needs to index all the venues, and that is harder going back in time before the internet. Things weren't digitized then. The scope of computer science has also changed, so what we consider to be CS has grown, whereas the things that were CS before, it might not have consistent coverage across those different venues. And then also the digitization and accessibility issue. So as I just mentioned, papers before 1990 were not really written on a computer, and so these things have to get converted into a digital form for DVLP to index them. So we can correct for these biases, since they're so nice and smooth, by just adjusting the pub counts upward based on this coverage trend. So if we see that you wrote 10 papers in 1985, we're just going to adjust upwards that number so that it looks like what it should be, based on our difference in coverage between CVs and DVLP. So that's one part of the messiness of DVLP. We can correct it because we have the CV data to benchmark it against. But there's another problem, which is once you do that, you find that faculty are getting more productive. So there's a sort of non-stationarity in the entire system that could shape what productivity curves look like. Right? If everybody's getting more productive, then you're less likely to see this drop in productivity because everyone's writing more papers. Now, we're not going to answer why people are writing more papers, but we do want to account for the fact that there is this non-stationary system. Okay? So here's what we look at. We find that there's a very consistent rate of growth, about +1 paper per year per decade of time, which is not that fast. I mean, academia is a very conservative, slow-moving system, so this is sort of not a reasonable point of view that somehow academics can figure out how to write an extra paper a year over 10 years of time. And this is independent of which indicator year you compare across careers. So if we take the first year of everyone's careers, or the 5th year of everyone's careers, this inflation, well, not inflation, this extra productivity is consistent across these things. Okay, so now this means that our correction for the DVLP data is going to be adjust for the coverage and then also adjust for the growth. Okay, so we want to index things essentially in terms of 2011 publication equivalents. That's going to be our equivalent. So this idea is a little bit like in economics when you inflation adjust your estimates of money in order to make dollars from 10 years ago comparable to dollars today. We just want to have things that we can compare against each other. So this correction allows us to account for both the coverage differences and also this non-stationarity and sort of the unit of measure we're using. Okay. There's another confounding factor though, which is that elite departments are a lot more productive than non-elite departments. So here we're just going to demonstrate that this is true, and then in the later analysis we're going to have to separate things by prestige to some degree. So if we look at the median number of papers that people write in the 10 years after their first hiring date, what we find is that, so this is the median pubs per person over a 10-year period, which is why it's such a big number, as a function of prestige. So 0 over here is the most prestigious computer science university. This pi ranking, we have an algorithmic way of generating it. It correlates with US News and NRC, so you don't need to know the details about how we do it, just that like Stanford and MIT over here, and Montana State University is over here. So what you see is that there is this consistent pattern. So greater prestige equals greater productivity, and the rate at which you increase your productivity is about plus 3.3 publications per year over a 100 rank difference. So the difference between here and here is about 3.3 pubs per year. So people at Stanford, for instance, are a lot more productive than people in the bottom half of the prestige ranking. It turns out that there's no difference between publics and privates in their productivity. Yeah.
Is that pubs per year or pubs per 10 years?
This is pubs per year.
Okay.
It's 33 pubs per 10 years. Right? So somebody at Stanford over the first 10 years will write 33 more papers than somebody at rank 100 will in those first 10 years, which is a lot of papers. So it's a big difference in productivity. But one thing that we found kind of striking is that so the black dots are the private universities and the orange dots are the publics. There's no difference between the slopes of the lines for the privates and publics. In computer science, we spend a lot of time gnashing our teeth over the difference between publics and privates because up here at the top 9 universities are all privates. And so there's a sort of myth in the culture that, well, there's something special about being private that makes them more productive. And it turns out that people don't think about all the privates that are down here. And then when you do, you realize that there's no difference in productivity between public and private. So there's something sort of fundamental about the way academia works that doesn't vary in terms of your status in public and private, which is, it's a nice way to puncture that myth, which may take decades to get rid of.
Just a question. The university prestige rank is depending on the number of publications as well, no?
In a very indirect way.
But so you are correlating two quantities that, in a sense,
Yes.
yeah, they are the same. Well, they have some hidden correlation. They are not independent.
No, and this is the problem with doing anything in the science of science, is that prestige is everywhere underneath. And so being able to control for prestige while still estimating in a data-driven way is really, really hard. In this case, the way we estimate the prestige here is based on placement power. So how likely are you to place a graduate from your university at another university? And if you have a lot of placement power, that means your graduates can go anywhere. If you have very low placement power, that means your graduates tend to only go to lower ranked places than you. And so it's true that productivity is related to placement power in some indirect way, but it's not exactly there. So the degree to which the prestige and productivity is tightly correlated in terms of causality, it's not obvious that we're doing anything violently wrong, although we do know that it's there. There's definitely some correlation. Yeah.
I think it's more than it's prestigious. I mean, it's prestigious, but also the economics of science of economics, or the money puts in, then paper out. So I think if you look at the endowment or research fund, it's a strongly correlated.
There's lots of interesting questions that we can try to ask here to try to understand why it is that prestige seems to produce more productivity. It could be that the students are better at the more prestigious place, which seems reasonable. Students who apply to graduate school often like going to more prestigious places. And so if there's any sort of sorting mechanism that the group of selection of the admission processes do, then that could change the sort of the quality of the cohorts of the different universities. That could be one. It could also be things like institutional resources. These places could be richer or better at raising money from the federal government. It could also be that they have lower teaching loads, which is one of my favorite examples. That universities down here, the faculty teach more, and so there's less time for them to produce papers. All of these things are possible explanations for why you might see this. That's a future line of research that we're not going to get into today. Okay. So now we have a way of fixing the DVLP data to try to do this systematically. We're going to correct for coverage, we're going to correct for the general growth rate, we're going to get the average publications versus how many years after your hire date are you. So we're only looking at productivity for people who were hired. So the 0th year is the first year you were faculty at a university, and year 10 is you've been there for 10 years. Okay? So we're going to index things to when people start their faculty jobs. And this is great. We've just confirmed that aside from this sort of a y-intercept shift based on the prestige, in which the The most prestigious universities have a curve that is shifted upwards relative to the others, but the shape is consistent across them, which is really nice. It suggests that there's a sort of universal pattern of productivity, that research productivity is very predictable. It has a rise to an early peak, and then the slow decline or flattening over time. Okay. So this is consistent across all the different prestige ranks. Okay. So maybe we can put a check mark here and say that, indeed, all this past work to suggest that this is this canonical narrative also holds for computer science faculty working today. Is there a question? Okay, so what we can ask the question is, does the average reflect individual behavior? So we're going to fit a simple model to do this. To each time series of a person, we have their publication count per year, like these gray dots right here. It's very noisy because publication rates are very noisy. You get a bad review, and that bumps this paper to next year for publication, or maybe it kills it off completely, depending on how you feel about it. So we're going to fit this very simple piecewise linear model. We're going to require that there be continuity in the function at this change point t star here, but otherwise it's going to be just these simple lines. And so this allows us to diagnose the shape of the curve in a very simple way. And this idea here of this rapid rise to early peak and the slow decline or flattening, that implies sort of 4 conditions on the parameters that we estimate out of this model. So this now gives us a way to say, does this noisy trajectory of publications, does that fit with the conventional narrative? So a rise would be that this first slope parameter is positive. An early peak simply says that this thing happens in the first half of your time series. A decline says that, well, this slope has to be negative, and rapid says that this slope has to be bigger in absolute size than that slope does. Okay. So these 4 conditions sort of define what we mean by seeing a pattern of this rapid rise to early peak and then a decline or flattening over time. So this now gives us a way to say, for all the trajectories we have, these 5,000 people, well, not actually 5,000 people, it's these several thousand faculty, what fraction of them follow this conventional narrative? Okay. So we're going to fit the model to each individual. We're going to exclude individuals that are better fit by a simple line, meaning that their publication rates increase steadily over their lifetime, or decline steadily over the lifetime. Both are possible. And instead, we're just going to plot the scatter of people in this slope plane for the ones that for which the 2-part model is the better fit. Okay? And so in this space, this octant right here corresponds to the rapid rise or the slow decline. So if the dots are in this octant, then their trajectory fits with the canonical narrative. And we made up labels for the other octants and quadrants. Things like late peakers and down and outers and things like that, just because it's fun to do that. So let me show you where the scatter is, then we'll talk about those patterns. Okay, you ready? This is the punchline. Okay, boom. So this gray triangle here, that represents the canonical narrative, and that contains 33% of faculty. The 33% of faculty follow the average behavior, this canonical narrative of rapid rise to early peak and then slow decline. That's not the majority. In fact, it's not even close to the majority. So 2/3 of people follow some other pattern, which is really worrying, in fact. It says that this almost 200 years of research saying that it's this particular pattern is wrong. Instead, we see this enormous diversity. Right? So people in this triangle here are late peakers, people who have a rise and a fall, but the peak happens in the second half of their career. In fact, there's many dots in this triangle as in this triangle. So you're just as likely, if you're going to have a peak, you're just as likely for that peak to be in the first half of your career as the last half of your career. And the stuff over here, like if you're in this quadrant, this point right here, you're sort of very slowly decaying, and then something amazing happens and you bounce back up. These are the people who maybe they exit research, they become inactive, they have one paper every now and then, but for the most part they're not research active. And then people like this are really remarkable, right? So they're improving at some rate, and then something really amazing happens and they improve even faster. So what we find is that there is an enormous diversity in the productivity profiles of individual researchers, it's true that most researchers are down here in this peaked-like structure, either early peak or late peak. But that only accounts for 2/3 of people. Everybody else are somewhere else. So what this tells us is that these trajectories are really unpredictable. We did a little bit more analysis in this scatter. What we can say is that since we have the gender variables for faculty, we have to tell whether or not the scatter is statistically distinguishable from each other. And it turns out it's not. Women are no more or less likely to have one pattern or another versus men. Right? So they have the same behavior. We also do find that the initial slope, that M1, how fast you go up, it does correlate with the prestige of where you are. So if you're at a more prestigious department, you tend to accelerate slightly more quickly. And the difference is not trivial. You know, it's almost half a paper a year in some sense. And the intercept itself seems to correlate to some degree with past productivity. So we know that productivity correlates with prestige. So if you came from a prestigious university, your productivity would have been higher in graduate school. And so therefore we see that reflected in where your intercept is. And the same thing is true also if you're doing a postdoc. You've just done more papers, you're better at writing papers at that point. And so that status, having done a postdoc or not, also correlates with your y-intercept for your curve. So it does suggest that there is some sort of continuity in some of the beginning things that happen in your career and what happens in your faculty job. But overall, there's this enormous diversity. That means that faculty productivity is a lot less predictable than we thought it was. This canonical narrative that's been built up over 200 years is embedded in sort of the mores of academia, this notion that old people are not productive, and so maybe we should force them into retirement. I had a conversation with Don Farmer, who's at Oxford, a couple weeks ago, in which he was saying that, in fact, Oxford believes this and is trying to create a policy that forces out the senior faculty once they get past a certain age. And I said, oh, show them our paper. And of course, I don't believe that will change their discussion at all, but at least they'll know that they're making a policy in spite of the data as opposed to supported by data. In the US, there used to be a policy of forced retirement for senior faculty, and the faculty, with the help of the unions, managed to get that overturned. And so now, at most universities, you can work as long as you want if you have tenure. Whereas maybe 40 years ago, it was a policy that they could force you out to retire at the age of 65 or 70 or something like that. But this data suggests that there's no basis on productivity for a policy like that. That senior faculty can be just as productive or even more productive than junior faculty. That there's this huge diversity in terms of productivity profiles. Okay, we can do a little bit more with the model. We have this model, we have this data, we can ask more questions. What about this change point? Right? So we estimate this value for the faculty. Where does it occur? Well, what the model says is that, so this is length of your career here, and then we estimate where the change point happens, and this is the histogram for that. And that's sort of a special number, right? That's pretty close to tenure time. So the model suggests that people's productivity often changes around tenure, which seems reasonable, right? You get to teach more, you do more service, you're an adult now. So we can ask whether or not what the model says, agrees with what the data says. So the data here, we're going to ask, what's the most productive year you had in the course of your career? And here's what that heat map shows. We're going to exclude the early career faculty because they just haven't had many years over time. Instead, conditioned on you having at least 10 years in your career, all the way up to like 45, the black dot is a histogram showing how many people had their most productive year at that point. Yeah.
So if I go back to your previous slide, what's the level of fit across these different models? So if I were, what's the level of fit? What's the distribution of fit?
Oh, how good are the fits?
Yeah.
Oh,
If I were to ask you for one level of fit, would I observe the same distribution across different levels?
So what we have done is we've excluded all the points on this plot for which the two-part model was not as good. Sorry, yeah. First, the two-part model was not as good as a single line.
I understand that.
So those points we toss out, and then we ask a question about stability of the parameter estimates.
Okay.
And in particular, the gray dots represent trajectories that have an unstable or uncertain assignment to quadrant. So those things tend to cluster right around the axes because a small change in the data would cause them to flip into a different quadrant. And here, we're mainly interested in sort of counting what fraction of people have a different stylized behavior. And so if I can't put you in this quadrant or that quadrant, I'm not sure about that, then I'm going to put you in this unstable category instead. And so these fractions down here, unstable corresponds to 25%, stable 75%. So 25% of people have really sort of weird trajectories. But among the stable people, 32%, 33% are in this quadrant here. So the stability question about how good the fit is doesn't, we did that analysis and our answers are robust to that. So even being able to toss out the people for whom our fit is not so good, we still retain the conclusion that the canonical narrative only applies to minority people. So what we find by looking at which year did you have your most productive, your most number of publications, we find that it agrees pretty well with what the model says it should be. The peak here is right around 5, the model says it's right around 5.2, but you can see this long tail. Some people had their best year when they were 25 or 30 years into their career, which suggests that indeed there really is a lot of diversity here. You can't assume what someone's, you can't make a precise prediction about what a person's future career is going to look like just based on what they've done so far, although you can get some hints, right? You can probably do some extrapolation. Okay, so productivity overall is unpredictable, but is there something else about publications that's predictable? One thing we chose was author order, right? So we have this other canonical narrative that when you start your own lab, you're moving into the last author position, which is this tradition that people follow now. 50 years ago, when people wrote single-author papers, there was nothing to do here. But now, with multi-author papers, being last author is the prestigious one. That's the one where you're the PI of the lab, you're the one who's sort of designing the research, and the first author is the junior position. And so there's this narrative here too also that when you're in grad school and a postdoc, you want your first author publications, and then you should transition into being a last author position. And so in computer science, there's one field, theory of computer science, that follows an alphabetical rule. So we have a special trick that allows us to exclude papers for which the author order is alphabetical. So we're going to throw those out and just look at the ones in which this first to last author transition could be something we look at. And indeed, we see this very nice pattern that seems very reasonable. Right? So the orange corresponds to people at the top 50 universities, and the black corresponds to everybody else. And we have our last author publications and our first author publication. And so we see this nice transition between being first author to being last author. The transition point happens a little bit earlier if you're in a high-ranked place, perhaps because those are the places where the research groups get started more quickly, so you have students who take the first author position. Whereas if you're in a lower-ranked place, it may be that you're doing more work independently, it's harder to get your research group started and so on, for various reasons. So this seems so reasonable, right? It turns out it's also a lie. So here, we had to think pretty hard about how to diagnose whether or not someone was following this conventional pattern or not. And so let me explain what these things show. So this is first author rate in years 3 to 5 as a function of first author rate years 0 to 2. So we're taking 3 years here, 3 years here. We're just asking, what's your rate in this bucket? What's your rate in that bucket? So the y equals x line would correspond to stability, consistent author rate for first author positions in these two buckets at the time. And so scatter that's below the diagonal says that I have a greater first author rate in the first bucket and a lower one in the second bucket. So that's stylistically, I'm making this transition away from being first author. Look at that scatter. I mean, there are people who are even doing more first author papers in their second 3 years than in their first 3 years. Most people are down here. This is for the top 50 departments. You see even more scatter for people who are below the top 50, suggesting that there's some other factors that are shaping the rate in which they transition from first to last author that must have something to do with research groups and resources and so on and so forth. But this enormous variability implies that this nice average pattern, it's not really something that we should think about. Right? We should not think about averaging across individuals. We should think about the ensemble, the diversity inside this.
So how would it look like for a longer period of time? You just have 5 years, but the other plot was for much longer.
That's right. So here we're taking this and we're saying, we're going to look at what your average rate is in this bucket, and we're going to compare it to the average rate in this bucket. If you were to compare this to this, then you'd expect to see more transition.
Yeah.
So that would imply that the scatter will be squished down to here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that the case?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. There are sort of these like very broad, weak forcing patterns in the data, But there's always this scatter. I mean, look at these people over here along this axis right there. So these are people who only had first author publications in their first 3 years. And then they had some variety of first author publications after that. And there are people up here who only write by themselves. And so they're not, these people up in this group are not transitioning very quickly at all into being last author positions. So there's a huge diversity. People down here, start off not being first author very much, and so there's not much room. So if I think about how these things are being sort of squished into the average, really there's this big variance around these curves. And the average is not really representative of many individuals in the population, the same way we saw for the individual productivity trajectories. Okay. So what did we learn? We learned that the canonical narrative is not representative of individuals. Only about a third of faculty follow this pattern, and that most faculty are different from this. So this diversity implies unpredictability, that even for this thing that we thought was very stable and very predictable, there's a lot more variability and thus unpredictability in the system. There's lots of interesting directions for future work. We really want to get to this question about prestige. Does prestige cause productivity, and how can we test that? That's a pretty complicated question because prestige correlates with everything. What predicts the model features? We've talked a little bit in terms of like gender doesn't predict them, where you did your PhD does predict them, and so on. It may be that the co-location of T star with sort of rough dates of tenure is a very important feature for driving the shape of these curves. And then what might a minimal model to try to explain this thing look like in terms of causality? Those are all very interesting directions for future work. Okay, so now I want to pivot a little bit, zoom back out, and think about predicting discoveries again, since that was how I started. I would remind you that there's this axis here that helps me think about things that are expected versus unexpected. And I think that what we can learn from this deep dive into the predictability stuff, along with other things that we know from the science of science, like Price's model about citation dynamics, et cetera, is that there are some aspects of science that are really, really predictable. Things like citation counts. We've had a huge number of papers over the past 15 years or so that say that citation counts are very predictable. The distribution of them, the way they evolve over time, et cetera. Institution of origin for researchers is also very predictable. The maximum impact of papers is predictable. There's been plenty of research showing that interdisciplinary research is harder to publish and harder to fund, and that underrepresented groups like women and minorities in science receive less funding. So NIH has done a number of studies on its own grant-making mechanisms that show that they're biased in these ways. So in some sense, these aspects of science are really, really predictable. But other aspects may be fundamentally unpredictable. Things like, as we saw, productivity over career. Berkeley Sinatra has this wonderful paper showing that the timing of your most cited paper is sort of uniformly distributed across the papers that you write. Also, this seems like it's very unpredictable. And then also predicting the long-term impact of proposed work, whether it's a manuscript or a project, also very unpredictable. There's a program officer at NSF. I was chatting with him at one of the breaks for a panel, and I asked him, do you ever rerun panels? And he said, yeah. Occasionally the lawyers tell us we have to. There's some conflict of interest that emerges after the fact, and they say, just get a clean evaluation, throw that last panel out. And so this is great because now you have a randomized experiment. Same proposals, different people evaluating them. And what he said basically is that he didn't say these words, but he basically said they can spend $100,000 and get one bit of information about the proposals. They can sort the top half and the bottom half and know better. And this implies that they can't tell which ones are the most valuable, most likely to be useful projects. They can tell, roughly, these are pretty good and those are pretty bad. But instead, the process then tries to carve things up further and say, let me give a strict ordering on these things. And in fact, this randomized trials show that this is wrong, right? You can't do prediction better than this one bit of sorting top half and bottom half. The ending of the story is not so nice. I asked him, doesn't this seem like trouble for NSF? He said, no, because we get our paper trail. That's all we care about is having a paper trail. And that makes me feel very sad, but it also maybe explains some of these other things. Okay. So some of these things are predictable, some are unpredictable. That's very interesting. I think that in general, we've been looking at bibliographic information typically because it's abundant. But if we're honest with ourselves, it's really crude, and it's usually a lagging indicator of scientific innovation because it always reflects work that is at least 6 months or a year or 2 years old. It doesn't really tell us where the boundary, where the frontier of science is moving. So this presents an interesting question. Could we make better predictions with more or different kinds of data? Instead of just looking at publication counts, what if we looked at what was in the publications? Would that give us any indication of what a researcher is going to do in the future? Maybe. So the contents of the papers, preprints, workshop, research team communications, rejected manuscripts for proposals, peer reviews, publication reviews, all these things are different kinds of data that might allow us to make better predictions about how science is moving in the future. But these things are harder to look at because they're not as abundant. Right? It's really easy to go to the Web of Science, through their API and say, get all the data. Okay, maybe not that easy. But there are lots of research groups who are doing that. But fundamentally, that stuff is old and stale. If you want to make predictions about the future, you want to know exactly where the action is happening. And it may be that the bibliographic data is not really doesn't have that much information in it about that piece of information. Okay. So there are two sort of other general things that I thought about in this space of prediction. One is that the age we live in today with big data and algorithms, automation is happening. And the science of science is going to play a role in automating science. And there's a danger from this, which is that if there are positive feedback loops in the system, then you can get richer dynamics, which can amplify inequalities. And this is particularly dangerous if opportunities for future success are allocated according to markers of recent success. Because then, if you get lucky, then you get a chance to get lucky again. But if you don't get lucky, you're out. And if we've seen that, if we really do believe that science is unpredictable, as I think a lot of the research suggests that productivity and impact really are, then these positive feedback loops are very dangerous because they can exclude people who could have very great careers, make huge discoveries, but because they haven't been lucky in the past, they don't get chances to try it again. So it creates these self-fulfilling prophecies that I think would narrow innovation in general. So one thing that I'm trying to think about right now, and I hope you all think about too, is are there measures of success that are not susceptible to these feedback loops? And this is not an easy question to answer. Most of the things that I have thought of so far don't work because there is some sort of feedback loop that uses them. So this is one thing that I think would help us mitigate the danger that comes from automating evaluation by using the tools of science and science. Another possibility is that there will be this sort of automatic prediction of future impact, and this is already happening. There was a company that announced a product that they were going to sell to the journals that would allow, they would make a prediction for a new manuscript that had not been published yet, that was submitted. It would predict what its impact would be down the line. And it would base it on 500 features that it would extract from the paper. And you can probably imagine what these features are: the fame of the authors, the fame of the institutions that they are writing from, the topic that is being written on, maybe, I don't know, some other things, right? So all of these things happen to be stuff that has feedback loops associated with them, right? And so this is terrifying in some sense, that the journals are thinking about moving in this direction. And the universities may do this too in terms of trying to deal with the avalanche of applications for jobs. How do you sort through 1,000 applications for a cohort of 10 graduate students? You can't. And so you must start thinking about using automated tools to do it. But it presents this immense risk that will induce herding behavior and that will then hide some of the decisions from the humans who are trying to make them. So one tenet I think we need to be very sensitive to is this notion of fairness, accountability, and transparency in machine learning, this FAT-ML idea. And the idea of having humans in the loop that can evaluate the coefficients that come out of the models and understand, oh, if I change it this way, I get this kind of result, this way, that kind of result. We need to be able to audit these things to make sure that they're not somehow corrupting the system. And journal publishers they're not really friendly toward letting academics inspect what they're doing. But I think we could demand that they be more friendly. And this may be something that we have to do if we want to prevent the journals from essentially using these systems to reinforce the establishment in terms of like what science has done in the past. And that's surely what it would do, because if you want really new discoveries, there's not going to be data on those things in the past, right? Unexpected discoveries don't have data that allows you to predict them. But if all these things are based on what data is available, they're just going to double down on the things that are old and conventional. Okay. So zooming out even one more level, I think what we can say here is that science is really this large and diverse ecosystem. There's lots of different ways of being a scientist and contributing to the world. We saw with the productivity trajectories, there's enormous diversity in terms of how people can contribute to the discussion in science. And the science of science could expand this ecosystem, or it could contract it. If the principles that we extract out of the science of science are used to automate things in a bad way, that would then narrow innovation, shrink the diversity, force more people into these conventional buckets. But really, the lesson from ecology is we want diversity. We want people to be able to go where the science leads them and not have to behave in this conventional way that has no other reason for being than it's what the machines tell us. And of course, the machines tell us that we should do that this way because the data has misled us using a canonical narrative to say that this is how science should be done. So I think that if we take these messages at face value, what we really settle on is this notion that if discovery really is inherently unpredictable, then the best long-term strategy is to cultivate a diverse culture, a diverse scientific ecosystem, rather than try to automate the prediction of discovery. So with that, thank you very much. There are two papers that cover these ideas. There is this perspective piece that Dan Larimore, Roberto Sinatra, and I wrote in Science earlier this year about the limits of prediction in science of science. And then most of the productivity stuff was done in this paper, which is with Dan Larimore and my students Sam Wei and Allison Morgan. Thanks. Questions?
So if I would be a policymaker, I would say that the message from the first part of the talk is, okay, don't let retire people because they can be productively late, but don't give them tenure. Is that correct? Because they are more productive. The big, keep them under pressure. Just that you think about before you you push this as a policy maker.
No, that's a totally reasonable perspective. I think that the data suggests that the institution of tenure and the fact that it happens, 5, 6, or 7 years into your faculty job, that institution does shape many people's researcher productivity. But it may not be that the tenure evaluation is what does it. It may be that what changes after the evaluation is done. Right? So after, at least at my university, after tenure, your service load and your teaching load go up. And so it may be that for faculty at my university, our trajectories are biased towards this early peak and slow decline because once you get through the tenure hurdle, like there's all this stuff that discourages you to be productive. And so thinking about like not tenuring people, well, that's not the thing that really is important under this understanding is this other thing. Right? So maybe we should, if you want people to be productive over their entire career, maybe you should have a stable service and teaching load as opposed to having these things change over the career. If you want the older faculty to be more productive, maybe you should lower their teaching and service loads, which I know. We all like that idea, right? So trying to untangle the causality of the impact of these things on the observed variables, that's the long-term research goal. We just can see the patterns here. We know that there's some effect, but we don't know what the direction of causality is.
Another thing, well, we chat a little bit about this, that sort of when you think about these peaks and so on as reproduction, as having children.
Yes.
And I have children, I love them, they do not enhance my activity.
Not your scientific productivity.
Not my scientific.
But your biological productivity much higher now.
Yes, that my genes will be passed on. It's close zero.
Yes.
But I mean that is another thing that is missing from the data. I mean, some people will have children. There are also differences. Some children have different impacts on different people in ways that are in obvious kinds of ways.
Yeah.
How might you explore that element? And this is also might explain why there are these global averages of peaks
Yeah.
Across many domains, and then you reproduce and your productivity goes down.
That's right. And the nice thing about working on a topic that has a 200-year history is that previous scientists, mostly sociologists, have come up with essentially all the possible mechanisms that could explain why productivity would decline as you get older, and allocating time to other types of productivity, like taking care of children and so on, is one of the mechanisms. Another one, as we saw in some of the slides, was this notion that your physical capacity or your mental acuity might decline as well. And in academia, there's a rising service and teaching loads. As you become more senior, you're expected to run conferences and organize meetings as opposed to just participate in them. And so there's lots of these things that could be drawing time away from being productive. The children thing is something that I am particularly interested in, not only because I have children, but also because if we look at the data, since we have gender for the faculty, we can compute these average curves for women and for men. And what we find is that the women's curve is shifted by a year. So they peak typically about a year after men do. So that means that in any given year after they're hired, they look less productive than men of the same vintage in terms of their hire dates. And probably this is related to childbearing, because in our culture, women still bear a greater share of the child-rearing responsibilities and burdens than men do. So we have a grant from the NSF that's funding this project right now, and part of the project is to do this big survey. And so we want to get data from individual faculty that is not contained in their CV, because most people don't write the ages of their kids in their CVs. Some people do, but not everybody. And so we'd like to ask faculty these questions, like, when did you have kids? Did you take parental leave when you had the kids? What was the policy that the university had? If you took parental leave, how much did you reduce your productivity? Because it may be that men and women use parental leave in different ways, and that there might be some constraints on how women use their parental leave versus men. So trying to untangle these questions of the role of these different factors requires getting additional information that's not contained in the CVs.
Just a quick follow-on to that we had a particular way, a specification for estimating the curves. It could be a lot more complex than that, and for example, children enter the nest and then leave the nest.
Yeah.
And it turns out there are, I can at least anecdotally consider productivity effects there as well. And certainly, and so one might anticipate, for example, a curve where you go up, you go down, you have kids, you go down, they go out the nest, and you go back up again.
That's right.
That's not something that,
So with the data from the survey, we can begin to try to say, if we know when your kids were born, and we know your whole career productivity, can we predict when your most productive year will be, or just your very productive years? So I think that the data from the survey will really help us dig into some of these questions to be able to say, to what degree are things predictable from things like when your kids were born, when they were in your household, and so on.
But just the hypothesis with the data you already have is that if you split out men and women and you look for a more complex shape, you might actually see a difference in terms of second acts.
Well, in fact, that has been done by past researchers, in which they essentially say that the differences between men and women in productivity typically are early career things. So by the time your 25th year mark as a researcher, the productivity rates of men and women have equalized, and they don't deviate beyond that. And so there is some evidence that the differences have something to do with being young, which probably has to do with having small children as opposed to old children. But these are really interesting questions. I think trying to dig into them will teach us a lot about how can we structure academia in a way that supports certain kinds of things like trial rearing in a friendly way, as opposed to the sort of data blind way that we have been doing it so far. Yeah.
On the productivity curves, the inverted U's are used, but you threw out the straight lines.
Yes.
What portion of people were straight lines?
I think it was about like 20% were straight lines. So a surprisingly large fraction were straight lines.
I'm interested about the question of prestige kind of causing productivity. And it goes back to what you were saying a lot about how as scientists, when we contribute to a field, we have a sense of sort of the boundaries and frontiers of the enterprise itself. And it also reminds me of your talk on Tuesday about like how you use data about the network itself to get a sense of the communities in it. But are there some senses that like one boundary or partition of this field can be better than in others. So like if they say like a Chicago school, I don't really know enough about economics to know this, but that's like a term that seems to be linked with like prestige or of like goodness of the science that comes out of it. If they have like a better sense of the boundaries of science, can that actually drive the like research that comes out of the researchers in that institution?
I think the answer is absolutely yes, but it gets more complicated because of these positive feedback loops. So if things come to you as an institution because of your prestige, and your prestige is derived from the quality of your ideas, then that's okay. But what if the quality of your ideas changes? Does prestige also change in response to the quality of your ideas? Well, no. Right? Harvard is prestigious, it will be prestigious, it's always been prestigious, regardless of the quality of the ideas that come out of Harvard. And so in some sense, there's a decoupling between the prestige and the quality. And we use one as a proxy for the other, but that's without data. And so I think that surely gaining in prestige is usually related to doing better work, but reductions in prestige are not related to doing worse work, at least not on the time scale that you would want to evaluate. So the prestige dynamics of the long term are complicated, they're social, they're indirect, but they correlate because of these positive feedback mechanisms. If you look at US News ranking of colleges and universities, what you find is that almost every covariate you care about, the SAT scores of the incoming freshmen, the selectivity, the funding, the alumni giving rate, the GPA, like all of these things correlate with the US News score. And in fact, these things can't even be causal because there's one study that was really nice that showed that if you drop by, on average, one rank in the US News ranking, your next year's applicant pool for freshmen, their SAT scores drop by a certain amount. Right? So it's clear that people are using these rankings to make decisions about the things that the rankings are derived from. And so you get this nice feedback loop. There's another very nice paper that showed so the US News, the way it does the ranking is it sends these surveys to provosts and presidents that says, who do you think is good? Give us your ranking. And of course, every university puts themselves at the top, which US News then erases, and then looks at what they say about their peers. And what the researchers found is that if you want to try to predict what somebody's going to say about the ranking, last year's ranking is more predictive than anything else. So people are just reading the US News and saying, oh, I read that, Swarthmore College is really good, so I'm going to put it at the top. So these positive feedback loops are really subtle, and they are everywhere in academia. And so trying to figure out where they are so that you can cut them is the only way that you can really get to some independent notion of what quality and success is.
Did you know I went to Swarthmore?
Oh, you did? Haverford.
Oh my god.
Smaller arts colleges for the win. Okay, my last question.
I have a question. First of all, thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it. And my question is on your last slide. You suggest to increase diversity in science because it's in the long run will lead to greater success. And I really much agree with this vision. However, you didn't talk about how to do that. How do we actually increase diversity? Is it a problem on the funding side? Because I see in Europe, for example, there is a concentration of bigger grants for fewer people, or is it a problem with the peer review system in the sense that we need to let more people publish, or the top journals have too much power? How do we get to that vision, which I'm very much agree with?
I don't have a data-driven answer.
Yeah, that's fine.
But if you allow me to speculate,
Yeah.
in my opinions, I think that there's been plenty of research that has suggested the existence of these positive feedback loops. And the quantities that they are based on are probably the ones that are narrowing diversity. So if we demand that everyone get an NSF Career Award, then that demand is going to narrow the diversity of people who are doing science. Because not everyone who's a good scientist will be able to win a career award at that moment in their career. Instead, they might be more competitive in 5 years as opposed to as a junior person. There's also the point about where money goes, so the big grants versus the small grants, funding senior researchers versus junior researchers. My personal opinion is that junior researchers deserve more money than they are getting, sort of proportionally out of the system. That the system has been co-opted by the most senior researchers who, they just know how to write grants, they know how to play the game better. And if they are writing proposals that are being evaluated in the same pool as something that a fresh faculty member is writing, this one, the senior one's going to be more polished, be better thought out, even if the potential research impact is better for the junior person's proposal. And so the system is focusing on attributes that are not actually predictive of long-term impact and so on. So being able to identify these places where the system is focusing on wrong things, I think that's the starting point. And data can help us identify what those quantities are. But in the long term, we need experimentation. We need NIH and NSF and other large entities, including universities, to accept the limits of their ability to predict the future, and therefore be more okay with flipping coins and doing experiments in a controlled way, perhaps, to try to do the data science, to understand what are the causal relationships here. And that's a hard sell, because the players who are winning at the current game have no interest in changing the rules of the game, because they're winning at it right now. And who's winning? Well, the most elite universities, the senior researchers, these are all people who are on the advisory boards and so on. So I think the ability to change the system to encourage diversity will require essentially a social movement among people, among researchers, particularly young researchers, to demand that the oligarchy essentially start to do the science and start pursuing policies that encourage diversity, but in a data-driven way. It's going to be a long fight. We need to get Bernie Sanders involved. Thank you for your attention.